Hi, I'm Claudia Brancart, a producer from Up to Date, a podcast that covers the topics Kansas Cityans care about most. Every day, we have meaningful conversations with people who define Kansas City. We explore the city's character, which is sometimes complicated and hard to understand. So give us a shot and stay up to date with Up to Date.
The year was 1978. David Willard had just gotten a temporary job at the Field Museum in Chicago, reorganizing the bird collection. And someone mentioned to him,
just kind of casually in some social setting,
that birds kept slamming into a building by the lake.
And it piqued my interest.
It was happening over at McCormick Place, the convention center right nearby.
So one morning before work, I just walked from the museum down to McCormick Place and sort of brazenly trespassed around the building.
His motivation was scientific. See, if the birds are dead anyway, might as well take them to the museum, right? And add to the research collection.
I've said many, many times that had there been no birds that first time that I went around it, I'm not sure I would have ever gotten into a regular monitoring situation with that building.
But he did, because it turned out what he was dealing with was an exceptionally hazardous building.
It's not a building that I think anybody, when it was built, would predict would be a major bird killer, but it is right on the lake and has a massive amount of glass.
Imagine you're a bird, migrating all night long in the dark, flying along Lake Michigan, and just at about dawn, you spot McCormick's lakeside building.
This thing that looms almost, we've wondered if it could look like a forest.
It is, after all, about the height of a forest, and birds were just flying straight into it.
We started checking literally every day during spring and fall migration.
Getting there a bit before dawn, and doing this year after year after year.
I never felt totally comfortable, but a lot of the workers there knew us, and, I was the bird man.
The bird man, looking for dead birds, tucking them into bags. Field Museum folks saw these specimens as data for things like population trends.
If this year there's 20 white-throated sparrows, the next year they're 15, and the next year they're 10, and the next year they're 5.
It could make you think, maybe this is a declining species. But then something happens that opens a whole new dimension to their research. By now, it's the early 2000s, and people are catching on that light pollution is part of why birds hit buildings. Chicago starts a campaign called Lights Out. And the public agency that runs that building that David so religiously checks in the mornings, it starts turning off the lights whenever the space is empty.
And during some of those times, lights which had up until the early 2000s been on pretty much 24/7 started going off for some stretches. So we started to keep careful track.
A super detailed record of how many birds die when lights are on versus off.
When lights were out, it was a dramatic reduction in the numbers that would be killed.
But of course, the lights can't be out normally, right? So the bird deaths continue. By the 2020s, Field Museum folks have picked up 40,000 dead birds in 4 decades. And in 2021, David and other scientists published the findings in a prestigious journal. Here's what they found. When even half of the windows are dark, it makes a big difference. So imagine a spring night. Half the windows are dark versus every window has light spilling out of it. The scientists concluded bird deaths go up tenfold with the full lighting. Tenfold.
The biggest frustration over the years has been that there was a curtain that could be drawn.
Curtains keep light indoors. Obviously, that's what people like David wanted. Even though only some of the windows had curtains, they knew it would help. So why didn't it happen? A McCormick spokeswoman says logistics. We're talking a huge trade show center. Closing the curtains sounds simple, but it takes hours. Workers use electric lifts to get up there, and they need to do it when people aren't around. So the Lakeside Center remained a deadly hazard for birds. But then, a morning in October 2023 changed everything. It changed everything because that's when 1,000 birds died in a matter of hours. And that tragedy built the momentum to look for a different solution. From the Kansas News Service and KCUR studios, you're listening to Up From Dust. I'm Celia Yopis-Jepsen. Our buildings and light pollution are taking a heavy toll on birds, and 7 of the 10 riskiest cities for migrating birds are right here in the center of the U.S. Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, Kansas City, St. Louis, Chicago, Minneapolis. Spring migration is getting underway right now. The more we learn about migration patterns and birds and light and glass, the clearer it becomes that we can help. Some of the solutions are cheap, some are expensive, some are as easy as flipping a light switch. Point is, options exist, but it's about us as a society deciding our priorities. Back to Chicago. 15 years ago, David retired from managing the Field Museum's bird collection, but he kept checking McCormick. And that's why he was still faithfully doing visits on October 5th, 2023. This night when 1,000 birds died, can you tell me about that?
Yeah, because I walked down there in the dark.
It's maybe 5:30 in the morning.
Kind of oblivious to what I was going to encounter, but I climbed some stairs up to the level where the birds hit, and immediately at the top of the stairs saw a carpet of birds in the first section that I checked.
A carpet of birds. Grosbeaks, thrushes, warblers by the hundreds.
Almost panicked, and I'd never seen anything quite like that.
And while he's bagging dead birds, more are hitting the building. Literally falling around you?
They were, yeah. And I got partway around. I'd already used up almost all the bags I had. I thank goodness, had my cell phone with me.
He phoned for reinforcements, and they kept working. Some birds were injured.
We would gather the stunned ones and take a break off to the side to get them down into vegetation that was away from the building.
All the dead ones they carried to the Field Museum.
Backpacks full of birds.
The building's worst ever kill before that morning had been about 200 birds. So what the heck happened that made the early hours of October 5th so deadly?
This was a night when the lights were on and the curtains they have were open, and so it was set up to be the worst it could be that night.
Here's the thing. Weather had delayed a lot of birds on their trek south. At the same time,
it had been the first night that the winds were out of the north for maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks, which probably meant that somewhere up in central Wisconsin, it was like a dam building up to break.
The winds finally shifted, the figurative dam broke, and the motherlode of migrating birds spilled forward.
And there were videos of birds out over the lake where it looked like an insect swarm of birds moving south. Just really a spectacular night of migration.
It sounds so beautiful, but it was tragic at McCormick. And once David and his colleagues made their discovery, word of the kill spread fast.
Social media and people spreading the news, and then the mainstream media got wind of it and started asking lots of questions about it.
These rows and rows of birds you see pictured here met their death in Chicago Wednesday night.
Local birders say they've never seen anything like it.
Turn off non-essential lights during migration season, and that includes tonight.
But probably the most important thing was that U.S. Fish and Wildlife got involved.
The MPEA, the metropolitan agency that runs McCormick, worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And a spokeswoman says they also consulted half a dozen bird advocacy groups. So what was the decision? Well, there's this kind of film that you can put on glass so that birds can see it.
Film that has dots. Every dot is 2 inches from the next dot.
So last summer, 2024, McCormick added that clear film with white dots. It cost $1.2 million, and it took 2 crews working morning through evening for 3 months. They stuck the film on 2 football fields worth of windows.
I was kind of amazed when the first day in the fall that I went up there and literally every bit of glass had the film.
But could this clear film with dots actually work? Some people, including David, were worried it really might not.
Putting $1 million into something that has mostly been tested in the daytime.
What he means is scientists know that this kind of film works for keeping birds away from windows in broad daylight, but in the nighttime or at dawn? But the stunning thing is, so far, it does seem to be making a huge difference. Field museum folks typically find hundreds of birds each fall. But last fall, after the film was added, they found 18 died on the treated windows. We're talking a 95% drop. They see birds approaching over the water at dawn.
In the past, we would have watched them fly straight into the window and drop.
But now,
we'd watch them fly in and veer.
Scientists do like to have lots of data to draw conclusions, though, so now it's about seeing if this trend holds up. Obviously, David's hoping it will, and that McCormick is finally much safer.
One night of 1,000 birds was what raised awareness when 40,000 over 40 years wasn't enough to get any change.
The MPEA, that metropolitan agency, has said it strives to be a good neighbor and environmental steward. And its spokeswoman told me that in addition to a policy to turn off lights in unused spaces starting in the early 2000s, McCormick management has cooperated with the Field Museum's bird collecting over the decades. And the MPEA is extremely excited to see that the new window treatments are working. Okay, now let's broaden our lens, because McCormick is just one building in one city, and there are other cities in the middle of the country that are incredibly risky for birds too. But why is specifically the middle of the country so problematic, you may ask? Well, let's get into that next.
There's an environmental crisis out there that could change the way we grow food and how we eat.
They said if we don't save the pollinators, things will get ugly pretty quick.
Welcome to the world of Buzzkill, a new podcast from the Food and Environment Reporting Network, where we take on the pollinator crisis, what it is, why it matters, and what we can do about it. I'm your host, Teresa Katsourelis. Join me as we tell the stories of people working to protect pollinators and biodiversity. Buzzkill is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't listen to what anyone else tells you. Podcasting is not easy. Sure, it's fun and accessible, but if you hold yourself to a high standard of fact-checking and have integrity in your reporting, it's a bit of a beast. But it's worth it. We give you our very best because you deserve it. Would you meet us halfway? Please make a donation. Visit kcur.org/support.
To learn what's happening in the middle of the country, I got help from Andrew Farnsworth, a visiting scientist at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Andrew, you could say he's been studying migration since he was a kid growing up near New York City.
5 or 6.
Running around with Grandpa's binoculars and Peterson Field Guide.
I was already taking notes about what I was seeing.
And in 1980, there's this night.
Just after the sun went down.
Andrew's 7, and he hears...
Whoa, I know what that is. There's no question.
This kid knows a green heron.
Very explosive.
And yet it doesn't add up.
It's up there, and it's dark.
That's not normal, right? But then Andrew realizes it is migration season.
And I remember making that connection.
Most migrating birds use the cover of darkness. Twice a year, they cruise right over our oblivious heads, hundreds of millions of them.
Hearing there's a bird actually doing this, that was sort of a huge spark moment.
Because nighttime migration wasn't just a thing in his bird books. If he paid attention, he could hear them crossing the black sky. Decades later, Andrew's still piecing together the mysteries of night flight. But with technology, scientists like him have figured out a lot. They use radar and thermal imagery, audio equipment to hear birds flying above, machine learning to parse all these huge amounts of data. This, by the way, that you're hearing, it's nighttime recordings of birds migrating in the dark. Let's paint the picture of what it might look like. Don't just picture a bunch of orderly Vs like Canada geese.
It's not at all what it's like.
This night world, it's more like...
If you have a snow globe,
imagine every piece of glitter in it is a different bird.
if you kind of swirl the snow globe around,
Hummingbirds, herons, woodpeckers take flight.
moving in kind of like the same direction.
Yet with tons of variation and messiness too. Loads of different species on the move.
Some that are really close to the ground,
Riding different winds in different directions.
and some that go up to like these incredible altitudes of 15 or 20,000 feet.
They've got hundreds of miles to go, or thousands. Some hopscotch, doing a few hours a night. Others push through till morning. Some bigger birds can even keep on going.
More than a night, more than a day, like a couple days at very high altitudes where the winds are really favorable to make these incredible, speedy trips from somewhere, far south in South America, all the way to the Canadian border or beyond, in single shots.
And this midnight magic is especially fantastic in the mid-continent, thanks to this region's good geography, landscapes, and weather patterns.
That all focuses on that area kind of between the Rockies and the Mississippi as the thoroughfare for birds in the Americas. If it's not the biggest, it's certainly one of the biggest on the planet in terms of the corridors and the sheer numbers of birds that are using that area.
Even many shorebirds headed from South America to Canada's east and west coasts funnel through the Great Plains, far from any ocean, instead of following the coastlines. And in fact, wetlands in Kansas, hundreds of miles from the nearest coast, are fantastic for birders trying to find shorebirds.
There is an incredible, tailwind scenario because of the way the Gulf of Mexico is positioned and the Rocky Mountains creating these low-level jet streams that are basically like southerly winds blowing from the south that are super supportive.
Birds need that help. Timing and efficiency are everything. In spring, a lot of them have to fly way, way north in Canada to boreal, even Arctic areas,
where you have these incredible explosions of food resources during the northern hemisphere, late spring and summer. Black flies, mosquitoes, like massive insect blooms, and that pulse of insects, that doesn't last all summer, right? There's a very particular window when that happens.
A window when birds need to claim territory, build a nest, hatch chicks, raise them. So they're hustling north for that window. Some nights, hundreds of millions of them are flying along this central corridor northwards. Spring migration is a few months long, but actual bird movement isn't equally dispersed in that time frame. Mind-boggling numbers of birds pick specific nights to take wing. It's like they all got the same memo. A memo that says, tailwinds, temperatures, everything's lining up, guys, let's go. Today, scientists can forecast those big travel nights. It's called Birdcast. Andrew helps run it. Birdcast releases maps every day during migration to show where in the U.S. huge numbers of birds are expected to move each night. And for some cities, like if you live in Kansas City or Chicago, you can even sign up to receive alerts when there's going to be high migration numbers that night. And when so many birds fly, by the way, if there's also a full moon, you can actually get a glimpse of it.
If you look with binoculars and a telescope at the full moon, not for too long a period because it is exceptionally bright and you will hurt your eyes if you look for too long. But if you put a telescope or binoculars up to the face of the moon, you will see birds passing.
Such heavy migration, it's a stunning image. But it's also why cities in the heart of the continent are so threatening.
So where large numbers of birds overlap with humans and lots of light at night, there is a potential for a real challenge.
Remember the 7 cities I mentioned earlier? Well, They make up most of the top 10 list for the riskiest cities in our country for migrating birds each spring. Let's tick through them again. San Antonio, Dallas, and Houston in the south, then Kansas City and St. Louis a bit farther north, and finally Minneapolis and Chicago. And scientists can't prove which cities kill the most birds, but this list is based on everything that they've learned so far about migration and how birds are dying, etc.
And the light is attractive to birds and is disorienting.
These cities are glowing beacons of danger right where so many birds need to pass. Some birds hit lit buildings, like McCormick in Chicago. Others land and wait for daylight. Then they smack into a window after the sun's up, or can't find enough food, or get grabbed by a cat. Migration has served birds well for a very long time. And light pollution, it's so new.
100 to 150 years old, depending on where you are on the planet. Which is, just sort of a glimpse in time.
A small blip in time, but with colossal consequences. The latest research suggests building collisions kill 1 billion birds each year. And that number is just for the U.S.
1 billion birds every year is an enormous, enormous number. I mean, that is just it's almost unfathomable. And so that's like a bird every 30 seconds.
Now, that number folds together two phenomena that are hard to tease apart. Nighttime deaths, when lights confuse birds and they slam into buildings, and daytime ones, when birds fly into glass because they can see blue skies and trees reflected in it, or because they can actually see greenery that's on the other side of the glass. You may already know that North America has lost 1/4 of its bird population over the past half century. All these collisions are a big factor. And yet, all is not lost. Let's review why. People like David check buildings in many cities. A lot of them are doing it as volunteers. And thanks to them, we are learning a lot. And thanks to property owners willing to make changes, some buildings are now safer. In 2017, about 400 migrating birds hit an office building in Galveston, Texas. And almost immediately, the company turned off the floodlights that normally lit up the facade. It also worked with the local Audubon to raise awareness. And this lights out movement keeps growing. In Texas, 24 cities and counties so far have pledged to cut back on non-essential light during migration. But Andrew says you don't need to own office buildings or convention centers or even live in the middle of a bustling downtown to help. We can all make a difference here.
Even on small buildings, even in suburbia, even, the housing development where I live?
Yeah. So the notion that the problem is just in cities is wrong. Your kitchen window, your living room window, your glass door, whatever it is, when you walk outside and you find a dead bird beneath glass, you can address that.
For example, by turning off extra lights outside your house, or drawing the kitchen curtain closed at night, or hanging something on your most problematic windows. How to get started?
I think, frankly, the easiest thing, visiting American Bird Conservancy's website.
That's abcbirds.org. There are lots of options, from good old window screens to subtle vertical cords, translucent tape stripes, and of course the dotted film like at McCormick. These all help birds recognize a pane of glass as a solid thing that they can't fly through.
You talked about 1 billion birds, and that's it's mind-boggling and it's sad. I wonder if you feel hope that we can, tackle a problem that big.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I there are a lot of challenges in the world. This is one of them, obviously one of many. But I do feel like, in a lot of ways, this one is a pretty easy one, in the sense that there are very specific kinds of actions that lead to conservation successes.
And in particular, when it comes to reducing light pollution, drawing curtains closed or turning off lights that we don't need, even just joining seasonal lights out programs during peak migration. And doing these things, it doesn't just help birds.
especially when you start to think of all of the additional good things that come with these actions to stop, birds from dying. Like on the light side, the energy saving, the human health benefits of turning lights off at night and not using them. These kinds of things sort of all go hand in hand, sort of making that a no-brainer.
So, all those additional good things Andrew mentioned that come from cutting light pollution, we're going to keep digging into that. And we've got just the people to help us out in one of our upcoming episodes. In the meantime, Up From Dust is a production of the Kansas News Service, aka the NPR stations of Kansas, and KCUR Studios. This episode was reported, written, and mixed by me, Celia Yopis-Jepson. My editors are Mackenzie Martin and Stephen Caranda. Big thanks to Suzanne Hogan, Gabe Rosenberg, Genevieve Demarteau, artist Jessica Corneliuson, who created our podcast logo. Music provided by David Condos, Tom Lonnie, Milktooth, and Blue Dot Sessions. Bird recordings by Paul Marvin via Cornell Labs Macaulay Library, and by Mark Bonta, Russ Y, and Chris Tasalia Himes via Zeno Canto. For our very next episode on Up From Dust, we are visiting a place in Kansas I didn't even know existed. So come along, meet some really fun guys. Oh, no, actually, I mean fungi. Till then, thanks for listening.